How can artillery best be employed to support the infantry as they're making an attack? We look at the lessons for the employment of artillery from the Battle of Bullecourt.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 76 of the Principles of War podcast. This is the last episode in our series on the lessons for the employment of artillery from the First Battle of Bullecourt. This episode will finish up looking at the general planning considerations, and then we'll move into the artillery-specific components of the lessons for Bullecourt. We're going to pick up the story on the early morning of the 10th of April, just after the attack has been called off because the tanks haven't appeared. On the morning of the 10th, thankfully it was cancelled when the tanks didn't turn up because battalion commanders were going out to the line, to their troops, with a different set of orders to what they'd briefed all of their soldiers on. There was no time for amended orders to get out to their company commanders and down to their platoon commanders, let alone down to the soldiers who were actually going to be doing the fighting. What a complete nightmare for them. After it was called off, there was the opportunity for 24 hours for them to go through it, but they still had differing orders that were coming down all the way from 5th Army headquarters. And of course, it went from 5th Army down to 1st Anzac Corps, then down to 4th Australian Infantry Division, then to the Brigades, 4th and 12th, down to battalion, then down to company, then to platoon, then the platoon commanders issue their orders. That's an incredible amount of work that needs to be done because at each level, they're distilling out of it the important information for them and their subordinates and doing their own analysis on it so that they can create a set of workable orders. No wonder it was a schmozzle, but hats off to the troops who actually conducted the battle under such a parlous command and control situation. Which brings us to the lessons for artillery. Now, it's interesting because I think we've baked in many of these lessons already because of the fact that artillery was so fundamental to the conduct of war in World War I on the Western Front. I'll start with a quote from Cyril Falls. He is the author of the British official history. Had Bullecourt been first unmercifully pounded by artillery and the whole attack been made under a barrage, it could have succeeded and the position could have been held. Now, we've looked at some of the lessons for artillery, particularly around sustainment and planning already. We're going to delve into those a little bit deeper, but we also want to flesh out some of the other mistakes that have been made. Let's have a think about the essential fire support tasks that we've identified for the Battle of Bullecourt. The first one, and it's quite a big one, is clearing paths within the barbed wire, allowing the advancing troops to be able to get into the German trenches. Secondly, we wanted to blind the town of Quillon. Numerous strong points, numerous machine guns. You've got gently rising terrain that looks down into the no man's land that the advancing troops were going to have to cross. There would be murderous flanking fire if those weren't suppressed in some way, and it was decided that they could be blinded with smoke. Next, a creeping barrage to neutralise enemy troops, keep them into their dugouts so that our troops could win the race to the parapet. The troops would lean up against the creeping barrage, staying as close as possible so that they would be in the trenches before the Germans would get a chance to come out of their dugouts. Counter-battery fire would need to be conducted, so this would deny the enemy the ability to use their artillery. There would be 3 phases for this: the preliminary fires, the fires before H hour, the fires during the advance, and then while the Australian troops were reorganising and preparing to defend the terrain that they had captured. That third phase was going to be critical. That was when the Germans would counterattack and they would be wanting to pour in as much offensive support as possible to support their counterattacks. Lastly, the easiest way to respond to a German counterattack was with artillery fire. They would be out of their dugouts, they would be moving across open terrain. That is an excellent time to be destroying them when they're in the open. And it's going to make it a lot easier for our troops to defend the terrain that they've won. Much of the difficulties that occurred at Bullecourt happened because of the fact that the wire wasn't cut. There was a growing realisation before H hour, before D-Day, that the wire hadn't been cut. Some of that information came from aerial reconnaissance. However, it's difficult to understand the state of the wire given the height and the type of cameras that were being used in 1917. Much better reconnaissance was being brought by troops actually going into no man's land and conducting their reconnaissance. And I've got a little paragraph on this. At Bullecourt, on the 8th of April 1917, when the 4th Division was preparing to attack the Hindenburg Line, Jacker, then intelligence officer for the 14th, made a dangerous night reconnaissance of the wire in front of the objective. He got through the wire in 2 places, brought back a report, and then went out to lay tapes on the assault line. As he was doing so, 2 Germans approached. He attempted to fire his revolver as they came at him, but nothing happened. Jacker rushed them, seizing the officer first, and eventually brought both in as prisoners. The attacking Australian troops then assembled unseen on the tapes, and Jacker's action undoubtedly saved them from bombardment and heavy fire. For this, he received a bar to the Military Cross. There has been speculation as to whether Jacker merited 2 bars to his Victoria Cross. Bean wrote, "Everyone who knows the facts knows that Jacker earned the Victoria Cross 3 times." Jacker, of course, probably the most famous recipient of the Victoria Cross to come from the 4th Brigade. And in fact, today, the battle group that 4th and 9th Brigade together raise is called Battle Group Jacker in remembrance of his incredible deeds. So with Jacker's and others' reports coming in, feeding the picture the fact that the wire has not been cut, we think of 2 of the principles of the employment of artillery, and they are economy of effort and sustainment. The wire was never going to be cut in time. It had been assessed that it was going to take 8 days to cut the wire in no man's land. However, not all of the guns were in position by the 10th of April, let alone the 2nd of April, when they should have been in position to commence that bombardment. Why was that? Well, there were 2 reasons. One of them goes back to one of the other principles of employment of artillery, and that is economy of effort. The attack on Bullecourt was a secondary effort for a diversionary attack. Many of the guns had gone to 3rd Army to support their main effort attack for the British Army. So there weren't enough guns to be able to conduct the bombardment. Not only that, the roads were a quagmire. It was very difficult to get the guns into position. And it's not just about getting the guns into position. Sustainment means providing the guns with the ammunition that they need to be able to fire the number of rounds to conduct the tasks that have been assigned to them. And we've got 5 tasks here. Not only that, there were insufficient fuses of the correct type. So this is the 106 instantaneous fuse that we mentioned a couple of podcasts ago. That was a fuse that when it hit barbed wire, it would detonate. And that high explosive detonation was much better at cutting barbed wire than the traditional fuse that had been used. When you're employing artillery, you really want to be thinking about the effect that you want to create. You don't want a delay fuse, which would dig into the ground and then lift large amounts of mud and dirt. You don't want point detonating because that will be ineffective as well. You really want that instantaneous fuse, which is going to detonate amongst the barbed wire, cutting it to pieces, allowing the troops to run across it. So for many of the planning reasons, this was totally ignored. Gough was either ignorant of it or ignoring the fact that the wire was never going to be cut. One wonders how often he'd actually gotten out to the front lines to see what the conditions were like that the troops were in, to see how hard it was to actually create that logistic effect. I've researched the second task, which was the blinding of the town of Quillon. Now, this is something that Haig had actually directed, but I can't see what happened with it, although there is passing reference in Coombs' A Greater Sum of Sorrow to the fact that a message was just misplaced. So that order never was acted upon. We know the fact that they received crippling flanking fire from the town of Quillon. What should have happened is that the artillery commander should have had the flexibility there to be able to respond to SOS calls for support and conduct an immediate neutralisation task on the town of Quillon. The trouble is, in 1917, there just wasn't the flexibility and the command and control to be able to identify what the problem was and to get that back to artillery headquarters. The creeping barrage? Well, there was a plan for a creeping barrage, and there had been allocations of ammunition made for that. It was stopped at the last minute. In fact, with orders coming less than 4.5 hours before H hour on the 10th of April, to state the fact that there would be no artillery support from a creeping barrage. That got to the battalions at that time, which is a bit of a nightmare for their planning, but it had been cancelled because of the difficulty in coordinating tanks and artillery. It was thought that the tanks would keep ahead of the infantry. It was their job to cut through the wire. It was their job to neutralise the strong points and then to push on and to really create that exploitation as they punched through the Hindenburg Line. Now, of course, many people thought that that was never going to happen. But if that did happen, it was going to be very difficult to coordinate where they were and where the artillery was meant to be falling. So that was why there was going to be no creeping barrage to support the infantry moving forward. This lack of cooperation came down to the inability to communicate between tanks and their higher headquarters. This inability to communicate would mean that it would be very difficult for higher headquarters to conduct battle tracking. They wouldn't know where their own soldiers were. They wouldn't know how well the advance was going or not. Now let's have a look at counter-battery fire. This is really quite interesting. By the time of the Battle of Bullecourt, the war's been going for about 3 years. And as far as the employment of artillery, up until the end of 1917, the Germans were definitely leading as far as doctrinal development. Even the development of the concept of the employment of artillery was lagging. And still in 1916, Haig believed that artillery was an auxiliary arm, and it was given much less importance than it was in the German army. To give you an idea of the growth of importance of artillery in the First World War, at the start of the war, for every 100 infantrymen, there were 18 gunners. By 1918, that had grown to 40. Artillery doctrine had struggled to make the transition from open mobile warfare to the static warfare that was seen on the trenches on the Western Front. There was also confusion about the best way that artillery could support the infantry whilst they were attacking. Only 50 years prior in the US Civil War, artillery was traditionally employed in the front line, firing directly at the enemy infantry. The advent of the machine gun and the increasing range of infantry small arms made this position untenable. Artillery started to be employed in dead ground, behind a hill, so that they were out of the line of sight of the enemy infantry. This created the problem of how to find artillery that you're unable to see, as well as how do you control artillery when they can no longer see the target that they're firing at. As the ranges of artillery pieces increased, it also became more difficult to locate where they were in the battlefield and to be able to strike at them. In the German army, counter-battery fire was given much higher importance than it did in the British army up until 1917. In fact, their first doctrine was only released in 1917 on how to conduct counter-battery fire. In 1918, two of the critical ways that hostile batteries would be identified would be through flash spotting and sound ranging. By 1917, neither of these techniques were widely available in the British Army, and they hadn't come to the Australian Army by the time of the Battle of Bullecourt. That left aerial spotting, the use of the Australian Flying Corps, the Royal Flying Corps, to fly over enemy lines and then either take photos or conduct aerial OPs and adjust fire. Remembering that the Battle of Bullecourt was a supporting effort to the British attack at Arras, April 1917, it was called Bloody April in the Royal Flying Corps because of the number of casualties that they suffered. This was the nadir for the Royal Flying Corps. They suffered 245 aircraft losses. These losses were predominantly based in the supporting activities for the Battle of Arras. This means that it was difficult to get RFC aircraft to be able to support the attack at Bullecourt. The The cancellation of the pre-assault bombardment also meant that the guns were firing without having conducted registration missions. This made them significantly less accurate. Also, some of the batteries, late into their positions, were firing without their bearing pickets, meaning that they were effectively firing into the blue. This made the counter-battery fire largely ineffective. This is borne out by the fact that the German artillery only suffered 10 deaths on the 11th of April. The counter-battery effect was so weak that German gunners were able to drag their guns up onto the ridgelines and fire directly at tanks and infantry caught up in the wire over open sights. The men in vehicles silhouetted against the white snow would have been sitting ducks. Lastly, we need to look at the inability of the Australian artillery to respond to German counterattacks. This is critical, given Murray's statement that with adequate artillery support, we'll be able to hold this position until the cows come home. Horner, in his book The Gunners, provides part of the answer. The incident illustrated the fact that artillery communications were still being developed and that insufficient FOO parties, or forward observation officer parties, were deployed. The main duty of the FOOs in 1917 was to get into position where they could detect an enemy counterattack and send back an SOS signal if necessary. Normally, only one FOO party was employed for each artillery brigade. A FOO party consisted of 2 officers, 2 orderlies, 2 telephonists with telephones, 2 linesmen with wire, 2 pigeon men with pigeons, and 6 signallers with Lucas lamps. 1 officer carried out the duty of reconnaissance and collection, while the other organised the communications and transmitted the information. Multiple SOS flares were sent up requesting immediate support from the artillery for the infantry in those forward lines. However, Lieutenant Colonel Rabbit in artillery headquarters was receiving information from the FOOs that they were seeing troops forward of their own positions moving on to the town of Bullecourt. This created a significant dilemma within that headquarters and higher headquarters. The reports of successful penetrations of the line were fed all the way up to Gough's headquarters. Murray's report, sent by runner, took over 2 hours to get to brigade headquarters. So Rabbit in artillery headquarters was probably receiving information via line in near real time. But why would these reports have been sent in the first place? Reading through all of the various accounts, it's quite possible that it was Australian troops who'd already surrendered and were moving into the rear of the German positions were what had been seen. We do know that a lorry had been sent out from one of the German reserve positions to Bullecourt. This was quickly turned around. If this is what had been observed, it could have been confused as a tank advancing into the depth of the German positions. Either way, it's the role of the higher headquarters to take all of the information coming in from all of the sources and fusing it together to create a coherent picture of the battle space. This is clearly something that the artillery headquarters struggled with. The role of the forward observer is to coordinate and provide offensive support to the supported arms. Critically, they are also required to provide battlefield commentary, to provide the headquarters with the situational awareness of what is occurring on the ground. The histories make it unclear of how many reports of battlefield success had come through. Was it just one? Was it multiple reports? We do know that Rabbit had queried that initial report, and it had come back in the affirmative that yes, a breakthrough had occurred. However, we also know that the brigade commanders argued vehemently that there was no way that there were any troops forward of OG2. This is an extreme example of the impact of the fog of war, the inability for the artillery to respond appropriately to German counterattacks doomed the 4th and 12th Brigades. Their positions would become untenable and they would be forced to either surrender or try and make a perilous journey back, moving through the German barbed wire a second time in their withdrawal. I think these are the salient lessons for the employment of artillery. I wanted to look at the First Battle of Bullecourt because it highlights the risk that commanders run when they neglect the time, planning, guns and ammunition that are required to properly provide offensive support to a supported arm. Apart from these lessons about the employment of artillery, what is it that we can take from Bullecourt? I'll leave this to Bean to answer. He wrote, "There remains for the 4th Australian Division that honour which comes to a magnificent instrument recklessly shattered in the performance of an impractical task, to an incomparable weapon which, woefully mishandled and thrown at an impossible target, nevertheless, by its sheer clean strength and elasticity cleaves its way deep into an apparently invulnerable side, and stays there until wrenched off by a power too strong for it. The action of the 4th Division at Bullecourt, if it served as a striking illustration of an attack that should never have been made, furnished also a classic example of success by determined infantry against insufficiently cut wire. The entanglement which faced both brigades was as intact and many times as deep as that confronting the 7th Brigade on the night of the 29th of July 1916 at Pozieres. But leadership, superb by reason not merely of bravery and devotion, but of capacity and the individual determination of the men, carried the force through two such barriers, despite the heavy losses at each. Importance cannot always be attached to the phraseology of congratulatory messages, but the simple words of Birdwood in forwarding Gough's appreciation of the splendid effort of the division were true. We have no cause to be disheartened at having failed to retain our footing. Rather, we can feel proud of the magnificent bravery displayed." Ben goes on to ask, what might not these troops have achieved if prudently employed? One gain they secured, not without value, respect for themselves and their countrymen among all who knew the true story. The next battle that we're going to look at is another 4th Division battle, and that's the Battle of Amel. And this is what right looks like. This is where a combined arms effect is created. This is where the planning is put in, the resources are gathered, and everyone, down to section commanders and individual soldiers, fundamentally understand the role that they are to play. The experience of Bullecourt in some way set the Australian Army on the road to Hamel. It set them up for success by highlighting the lessons that needed to be learnt and fundamentally understood to be able to create a true combined arms effect. The next podcast to be produced will be on the Second Battle of El Alamein, a 9th Division battle, where we're going to look at what happens when that combined arms effect isn't capable of being generated. How do you problem solve with high explosives? Second El Alamein was the apogee for Australian artillery in the Second World War. Once again, lots of great lessons to be reinforced about the employment of artillery. If you've learnt anything from our series on the Battle of Bullecourt, please like or share our posts on social media and or include it in your PME program.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.